When we moved to Barrie a couple of years ago, we had a real estate agent who was recommended to us by a friend. And it turned out that the realtor who was helping us look for a new house was very good at what he did. He was very helpful. He really listened to our comments about different houses, and he really helped us zero in on something that met our needs. And so he was quite good at his job. That was very evident. And I remember when we had finally chosen a house, we met the agent at his office to sign the offer forms that would be faxed over to the agent for the owner of the property. And when we arrived, I found that our agent had the corner office at his agency. A beautiful big corner office with windows on two sides, and I remarked to him, I said, "Wow, you've got the corner office. You must be doing really well." And he said, "Yeah, but it's what have you done for me lately?" In other words, his boss would be more than happy to move him out of the corner office if he didn't keep producing results month after month or year after year. What have you done for me lately? Yesterday's work isn't going to count for very much tomorrow. Frank read so well from us an episode from the book of Exodus known as the Golden Calf. The Israelites had escaped from Egypt and had been wandering in the wilderness for some time. After a period in the wilderness, they arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses had gone up to the top of the mountain and had received the 10 Commandments from God. Moses had then come back down the mountain and reported on the reception of these commandments to the rest of the Israelites. And then Moses had gone back up Mount Sinai to continue in conversation with God and to continue receiving more of the law. And on the second trip up the mountain, Moses was there for a longer period of time. And down at the bottom, the people were getting impatient. And so some of them went to Aaron, who was the younger brother of Moses and sort of the deputy leader, and they said, "We don't know what's happened to this guy, and we don't see God really doing anything at the moment. So how about you make for us a God who will be with us on this wilderness journey? Make a God for us who will be able to go with us." Really a stunning decision by the Israelites. For in their relatively recent memory, God had done a great deal for them. Remember, it wasn't that long ago that they had been slaves in Egypt. God had sent Moses to argue with Pharaoh and to eventually lead them out of their slavery. After they had begun to leave Egypt, they came to a body of water, and who knows exactly what body of water it was, but they were able to cross it. And no matter what body of water it was or what were the circumstances that allowed them to cross it, they interpreted it as divine intervention. And then once they were completely free of the Egyptian army who'd been chasing them, they were in the wilderness and they faced a host of new challenges. At one point, they had no water and they were getting thirsty. And then God sent them water from a rock, and they had water to drink. Later on, they were hungry. They had no food to eat. And God sent the manna, sometimes called bread from heaven, which was like a frost that lay on the ground, and somehow it was able to provide them nutrients. And at the same time, God sent them a flock of quails, so they had more nourishment. And even despite these things happening to them in recent memory, these gifts from the hand of God, they have suddenly become very impatient and gone to Aaron and said, "You'd better make us a little god so that we're not going to be all alone out here." It's like the Israelites were saying, "What has God done for us lately?" Some of you may have seen the classic Monty Python movie from the 1970s, The Life of Brian. Brian was this guy who was born in the stable next door to Jesus, and throughout his life was therefore mistaken for the Messiah, right up to the point of being crucified. And at one point in the movie, the high priest and some of the other religious leaders in Palestine are together, and they are trying to plot the overthrow of the Roman regime, the Roman Empire, which is occupying Palestine. And the high priest, played by John Cleese, said, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" And as a matter of fact, the religious leaders are able to come up with a number of things that the Romans had done for them, such as the aqueducts, and the roads, and the sanitation, and the public order. And then the high priest says, "Well, except for the aqueducts, and the roads, and the sanitation, and the public order, what have the Romans ever done for us?" We can picture the Israelites. Well, except for leading us out of slavery, and except for giving us water from a rock, and except for the manna and the quails, what has God ever done for us? The psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. It's where we get used to good things, and we expect good things to be the norm, and we want ever more and more good things all the time. They say this is especially prevalent among people born in 1980 and after, which includes me. How easy it is for us to see all the good things that God has done for us and to dismiss them quickly as yesterday's news, demanding more and more and more all the time from God at ever more rapid intervals. So the Israelites went to Aaron and asked him to fashion them a god. And Aaron's response is truly remarkable. He didn't say, "God has told us not to do that." You see, they had received the 10 Commandments, the first of which said, "I am the Lord your God who has brought you out of Egypt and out of slavery. You shall not have any other gods beside me, and you shall not make any image of me." But Aaron didn't call upon that. He didn't even say, "We'd better think about this for a while." No, the Israelites came to him and said, "Make us a god," and he said, "Get the jewelry. Go and round up your gold." Well, get right to that. And so that's what they did. They rounded up their earrings, and who knows, perhaps some other jewelry that they carried. And the jewelry was melted down, and Aaron fashioned a golden calf. And there's been some debate among archaeologists as to what that calf might have been. The best evidence, I think, suggests that there was a calf that had been carved out of wood and covered with a kind of gold plating. And the calf was an image for gods commonly used in the ancient Near East. And so this is what Aaron made. And then Aaron said, "Here, O Israel, is the God which brought you out of Egypt." And then Aaron built an altar to worship this calf, this little statue that he had made, and he announced, "Tomorrow, a festival to worship this God." Some of you may have learned in school about the great Indian leader Gandhi. And Gandhi famously said once, "There go my people, and I must follow them, for I am their leader." I suppose there is some wisdom in that statement. For someone who is in politics or some kind of civic leadership, there is wisdom in listening to the voice of the people. But when one is acting or speaking on behalf of a God who has been revealed to us, it is not necessarily popular opinion which tells us something truthful about that God. And all of us have to be cautious and aware that sometimes in standing up for God's truth, we may put ourselves at odds with the larger group. So while Aaron was fashioning a golden calf at the foot of the mountain, Moses remained up at the top in conversation with God. And we find God interrupting Moses in mid-sentence as soon as this calf has been fashioned. And God said to Moses, "You better get down there right away, because they have just made a statue, and they have said that this is the God who brought you out of Egypt. You'd better go down and do something about that." And also God wanted Moses to go down the mountain, because we find that God was so angry that God wanted to be alone. We have almost in our modern imagination the idea of a God running up the stairs and slamming the door, because the Israelites had just done exactly what they were told not to do. And in fact, in fashioning a little statue and saying that this is the Lord, this is the Creator God who brought you out of Egypt, that is in a way worse than just saying, "Here is another God." For they have misrepresented the true and the living God. They have exchanged the God who had made them for a God which they had made, and said that these two things were somehow interchangeable. And so God predicted the annihilation or the disappearance of the children of Israel, who had so flagrantly broken the gracious covenant that God had made with them. There's a theologian, very popular in the 20th century, and still to some extent today, You've never heard of her, I don't think, but she's someone who has influenced the world around us. Her name was Sally McFaig. And this was her argument, that if there is a God, we cannot know much or anything about him or her or it. And so what we ought to do is make up a God, the belief in which would have positive implications for us. Make up a God that would somehow dictate positive outcomes for the way we live as human society. A very influential idea. The temptation is always there for us to create a God who will suit our own needs. But it is a temptation that must be resisted. Interestingly enough, Moses did not just go straight down the mountain as God had first indicated. Moses delayed to intercede on behalf of the people to God. And he said a number of things, and this is the most important. He said, "What about the promises that you made to our ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob? You remember how you promised them long ago that you would make them a great nation, that you would make their descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that all of the families of the earth would be blessed through them. You remember how you promised that to them and therefore to us, your people today?" As a minister, I have obviously lots of couples who come to me for their wedding. And I always meet couples about 3 times before their wedding day. And I really enjoy it. It's usually such a happy time in people's lives, and it's fun to talk to couples who are so excited and so happy about starting a new future together. And it's interesting how in this day and age, I think I blame wedding TV shows. But couples are so interested in the minutia of their wedding day. You know, what kind of soup will they serve at the reception? And they agonize over which of 3 or 4 different kinds of soup to serve. The big one that comes to me is they often want different pieces of music to walk down the aisle to. So the bridesmaids will have different music from the mother of the bride, and they will all have different music from the bride herself. And while that may work on TV shows, it's not practical. You cannot play an entire piece of music in the distance from the back door to the front of the church. And while they're so excited about these little details, I try to focus them on the vows. For the vows are what their wedding is all about. And why is it so important that they come up and speak their vows? And why is it important that they know what these vows are and that they've thought about them, and when they say them, they really mean something? It's because someday down the road, it's going to be really helpful and important to them that they could look back at a specific point in time where they made promises to one another. Their love and commitment is not just something assumed, not something unspoken that can be taken for granted. No, it is important that they have made promises to one another. at a specific point in time. And it's important that they've had their guests and that they've done this publicly, because as what they're really saying is that they want to be held accountable to those promises by their friends and their family. Moses called upon God to be accountable for the promises that had long ago been made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and which he believed God still wanted to keep to that very day. Then the Exodus writer or editor brings the story to a rather abrupt ending. For we find simply that God relented. That's it. No other details, no discussion or reflection. It's kind of interesting that there isn't a long reflection on that, because it's kind of awkward. Maybe not embarrassing, but almost. Here's a God who has sudden changes of mind. Here's a God who, at least when conceived of by human beings, can be on a kind of emotional roller coaster like sometimes we are on. And not only a God whose mind changes, but a God who's open to convincing. A God who could get really hot one minute and then have a person like Moses talk some sense into him. Simply, God relented. Because I think we're meant to be struck by the absolute willingness and therefore the suddenness of God's gracious forgiveness. Because it is in God's character to be faithful to us and to forgive us for our wrongs, no matter how heinous, at almost the very drop of a hat, simply when asked. What have you done for me lately? You know, I bet you that is a question that many of us have wanted to ask God at different times in our lives. What have you done for me lately? Sometimes we experience long stretches of time, at least they feel long, where God has not answered our prayer, or God has not intervened in some situation where we think divine intervention would be helpful. Or some long stretch of time when we're waiting anxiously for God to act and no action is forthcoming. And yet maybe we also think that what have you done for me lately is not a question we have a right to ask God. And I suppose there is a sense in which that is true. If we had perfect faith, we would never feel that God was acting too slowly or have any questions about why God was or was not doing something in our lives. But it is a question we can ask God if that is how we are feeling. If you are wondering where God has been or what God has done for you lately, you can go ahead and ask. Say it to God and mean it. Even in the book of Psalms, the prayers that are recorded in Scripture, the prayers of ancient Israel, we sometimes find this very question phrased a slightly different way. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? In other words, if you have something to say to God, go ahead and say it. If you are wondering where God has been in your life, Go ahead and ask. Say it to God's face, so to speak. That's what God wants you to do, is to be honest and open and bring your whole self to God. What you should not do is make up a false god to fill the gap, to make an image or to create some kind of idealized fantasy that can take the place of the true and living God, either in your life or in the world. You know, I think the story of the golden calf represents at its core a failure of the Israelites to be appropriately thankful for all that God had done. If they had truly recognized the incredible things that God had done and the gracious favor that God had shown, they would not have been so impatient for whatever good thing they wanted to happen next. This is something which is a danger for us in all times. It is not for us to look at the Israelites and say, "Oh, you bad Israelites, we would never do something like that." It is a temptation at all stages of history for God's people. And we overcome it by being thankful. What do we have to be thankful for? Many things indeed. Food, shelter, friends, family, the fellowship of the Christian church. Many things. We could be here all day talking about the things God has given us and the things we ought rightly to be thankful for. This Thanksgiving weekend is a good time to be reminded. We ought to be thankful to God, not only today, but every day of the year. To be thankful and to give God praise. Amen.